Welcome, everybody. I am Wendy Schiller, and I am the interim director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. And I'm also the director of the Taubman Center and a professor of political science. And we're very excited to have you here today for this incredible event. We are going to ask Ellen White, who is the fantastic coordinator of all of our events, to pass out index cards for questions. No index cards. We don't have any index cards. Microphones. Okay. We're not doing it that way this time. We are not passing out index cards. Usually we do. So we will not do that today. However, when you ask a question, I'll give you the run of show. We would ask you to keep your question brief. We have a packed house. We want to make sure everybody has time for questions. So we're going to start with my introducing Ambassador Susie Levine, and then she will introduce Ambassador Victoria Nuland. So we will go with my introduction first. They'll speak in conversation for about 25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes max, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So Ambassador Susie Levine is a 1993 graduate of Brown University. She has over 25 years of experience leading global organizations across government, corporate, and nonprofit sectors. She's a board member for Publicis Group, an advisory board member for Open Classrooms, and serves on the nonprofit boards of CareerWise USA, Research Improving People's Lives, and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. She has a long bio, so I'm going to skip a little bit. In the public sector, she served as U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, Commissioner for Washington State's Employment Security Department, and Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration. She led the latter two through significant crises and change as they navigated the pandemic. As ambassador, Levine partnered with both nations to significantly advance apprenticeship in the United States. These public sector successes leveraged her experience working at both Microsoft and Expedia, and as a stay-at-home mom to her two children. I should mention that she has degrees in English and mechanical engineering from Brown University. She also actively serves as a policy mentor in our Masters in Public Affairs program and has served as a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. So welcome, Ambassador Levine.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you all. Can you, oh no, you need to hear this because there's the,
press the little button. I'm used to just projecting. Thank you all so much for having us. And it is my incredible honor to introduce you to one of my mentors, and that is Ambassador Victoria Nuland. I always call her Toria, so I apologize if in advance I don't mention her title every single time. She graduated from Brown in 1983 with a degree in history.
I was 10 at the time.
In history and international relations, and is now the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor in the practice of diplomacy at Columbia University. Columbia University, and she directs the International Fellows Program and serves in the Institute for Global Politics. As a side note, it seems especially appropriate for me to be talking with you at this time because Shelby Cullom Davis was also a U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, although under Nixon and Ford, far before my time. Over the course of the 35 years from when she left these hallowed halls until now, she served 6 U.S. presidents and 10 secretaries of state from both political parties and rose to the rank of career ambassador, something only 38 other people have ever achieved. Her career reads like a history textbook, or I guess it would be more like a podcast or a reality TV show over the years. Yeah. For example, she started her foreign service career under President Reagan at the tail end of the Cold War, working on both China and Russia. Under President George H.W. Bush, she continued her focus on Russia, among other responsibilities, and was on the Soviet desk when the Berlin Wall came down. With President Clinton, she rose in the ranks, ultimately serving as the Deputy U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO, a position she held into the President Bush era. And it was under President Bush that she also served as Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney during the Iraq War and was named as ambassador to NATO. Under President Obama, which was when I got a chance to meet her, she held the roles of special envoy and was serving in the very high-profile role of State Department spokesperson when the attack in Benghazi occurred, and then as Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia when the Maidan Revolution, or Revolution of Dignity, in Ukraine happened, along with the Russian invasion into Crimea. Most recently, under President Biden, she was serving as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs when the Russians invaded Ukraine and when the war in Gaza started. Secretary Blinken has this and more to say about Toria upon her retirement. These experiences have armed Toria with an encyclopedic knowledge of a wide range of issues and regions, and an unmatched capacity to wield the full toolkit of American diplomacy to advance our interests and values. Personally, I am so humbled to call her a friend and a mentor. And after I was selected to serve, but before I was officially nominated, I will never forget the moment that we met. I was nervously waiting on a couch in an office, very kind of small little space. And I was sitting on this couch and she plopped down next to me and chatted with me as if we were all old, longtime friends. Put me so deeply at ease. And later, while I was serving in Switzerland, she frankly helped save my marriage when she advised I spend a little more time out of the country so that my husband and I could spend time together when I wasn't Ambassador Levine. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce you to Ambassador Victoria Nuland.
Well, that went on awfully long. Thank you so much, Ambassador Levine. I love this woman. She has energy. She has vision. She has commitment to the next generation. You guys are so lucky to have her here at Watson. Just as a small example, Susie never gives up on anything. She didn't in Switzerland. She didn't when she came back to the Biden administration. This morning, when my plane was 2 hours late, she said, well, you just get in a car, go to Baltimore, and then you can fly to Boston, and then you can make it here. And I was like, Susie, we will make it. And here we are. Anyway, I am delighted to be back on campus. I don't come here enough. But as we will talk about, Brown was formative to where my career went. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you. And I thank you in advance for your commitment to what's going on this planet, and to the fact that you care. And that I hope some of you will make your careers in international relations and foreign policy, whether you do it in governments, whether you do it in business, whether you do it in the NGO sector, because it's an amazing life and it's an amazing time. And as we will discuss, the world is changing a lot. But mostly, I just wanted to thank you, Ambassador Levine, for getting me back up here to campus and for all you do here at Watson.
For sure. And I'm sure that the team here at Watson will be happy for me to invite you back anytime that you'd like. So let me just start out. I'm going to kick things off. You started your career late in the 20th century, but this talk is about American diplomacy in the 21st century. What do you think characterizes 21st century diplomacy, and what are the key changes you see extant right now that weren't in place when you started?
Well, I would say actually we're back to the future, right? Which is an obvious point. I was at Brown at the height of the Cold War, early Reagan, went into the Foreign Service in Reagan. And I hope you'll ask me about my mentors and things here. And it was very much the bipolar world. And then we had this incredible experience of the Berlin Wall falling and helping the countries in Central Europe and Eastern Europe to have individual sovereign futures and to join the great democratic institutions. And now we are back. We used to call it the period of great power competition, as Russia and China largely decided that they were not content, were not satisfied to live and better integrate into the democratic world that we created, and instead believed that their autocratic model was better. And what we're seeing now, as all of you readers of the newspaper and folks who are out there in the world see, is an increasing convergence of interest and an increasing work together in common interest, whether it is in the United Nations, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is vis-a-vis Iran and North Korea. When not too long ago, the U.S. used to work intensively with both Russia and China to contain and roll back Iran's nuclear weapons program. We were partners in the six-party talks on North Korea, and now instead we see those four countries working together. And so, I think a lot of those lessons from early career about deterrence, about the more coercive pieces of diplomacy, about tight alliance with democratic partners and allies, increasing the opportunity for more countries to work with the United States, are very much back in vogue.
Thank you so much. So you referenced back to your time here at Brown. Are there specific courses or professors or lessons that you learned while you were here that are particularly salient to the work that you've done and that really inspired you into this career?
Well, I came to Brown mostly because I was a lazy butt and I didn't want a core curriculum. I wanted to be able to have a tasting menu, and so I loved the new open curriculum. But I will say that in the first couple of years, the result of that was I was a little bit lost. I was going to be a doctor, and then I was going to write novels, and my doctoring career fell afoul of a freshman course in biology where I think I got a C- or something. My father was very disappointed. And somewhere along the way, I found American history. I found international history. I found the spectacular Abbott Gleason, better known as Tom Gleason, who was a professor of Soviet and Eastern European history, who became my dear mentor and friend. I started taking Russian. I had, as a young person, fallen in love with Russian literature, just for fun, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov. And then in my sophomore year, my junior year, I took a poli-sci course with a professor who will remain nameless here at Brown. And that human was essentially teaching that the Soviet people deserved their crappy government because they had sort of some fundamental cultural and human failings and were not capable of open, free decision-making. And I sort of said, my Brown education kicking in, including my biology courses, that's not possible. And how can people who can produce Dostoevsky and Tolstoy be intrinsically evil and incapable of self-governance? And so I found Tom Gleason, who did not agree with that. And it was, as you heard, 1983, so it was still pretty heavy Cold War, but he encouraged me to explore all of the sort of history of countries and peoples who have liberated themselves from totalitarianism, authoritarianism. And I wrote a senior thesis for him on the Solidarity movement in Poland, which, as you may remember, was sort of 79 to 82 and was Poles beginning to look for self-determination and liberation from the Soviet sphere. And I became fascinated in all of those issues. And one thing you didn't say in my bio, I'm now a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a bipartisan, congressionally funded entity that the U.S. has had since Reagan to support democratic movements around the world. So it started here at Brown with Tom Gleason.
That's awesome. Now I'm going to jump straight into some of the big issue areas that we're looking at right now. Let's talk about Ukraine. You have been so deeply involved in Ukraine throughout your career. If you could wave your magic wand or elicit the butterfly effect, what would you have the West do differently?
Well, I think there's a question of whether we wouldn't have had to get to where we are now if we had been, if our answer to Putin's little green men effort in 14, 15, 16 had been different, or whether you're asking about when he launched the full-scale invasion, whether we could have done things differently.
This is more going back to 14, 15, 16.
Yeah. So look, Putin very successfully in those days, at least at the beginning. And first, let me just give my former boss, Secretary Kerry, and President Obama some credit here. And it's a very long story, which we won't tell now, but it essentially starts with the decision by Ukraine to try to associate with the European Union, and then Putin waking up in the fall of 2013 and deciding that that was a bridge too far, the Ukrainian economy being too weak to withstand the pressure of Russia withdrawing all of its financial support, the IMF not moving quickly enough to support Ukraine as an alternative, and Putin's big loan, which the price of which was that Yanukovych had to withdraw his application for the EU. And then Ukrainians hit the streets. You have the Maidan movement. You have all of that. We tried very hard in that period. And, you know, I was on the ground there, but obviously Obama and Biden, Obama, Biden, Kerry, and our European allies to try to make the Ukrainian move towards the EU less threatening to Russia. We weren't even talking about NATO at that time. We were, and to make it maybe a win-win, we kept on saying things to the Russians like, look, if Ukraine is a free market zone between you and Europe, Russia will get benefits from this. It doesn't have to be zero sum. And then when we began to see the buildup around Crimea, there was an effort to try to understand what the Russians wanted. At that point, Putin was saying he wanted a high degree of self-determination for the eastern parts of Ukraine that were Russian-speaking, Donetsk and Luhansk. We tried to work between them and the Ukrainians to create more of an autonomous area without undercutting Ukrainian sovereignty or their constitution. But by then, Putin had decided that the idea of a sovereign Ukraine was too disruptive to him, or not, you know, in keeping with his larger goal that Ukraine is nash, it's ours, and that just, you know, accelerates all the way through. Had we been, you know, I always felt in those years that we should have done more of what we did later, you know, stronger cost for Russia, for its little green men, for taking Crimea, for all of that, and that we should have put more global pressure on. Putin at that time, if you recall, was denying that it was them. He was saying it was an indigenous movement of Ukrainian nationalists, but that was obviously not true. And we were coming out of an intensive period of Middle East focus. And so we didn't have the intelligence and those kinds of things to show what was actually happening. So I wish we had done more then. I wish the Trump administration, Trump 1, had done anything, frankly, because, you know, Trump did have a pretty good relationship with Putin. And during those Trump years, Putin spent them building up his military in Crimea, building up his military on the outside. And then, you know, in this period, I think we did very well in 22 in galvanizing the world and putting pressure on Russia. But I'm not sure that we maintained it at the level of escalation that Putin threw into it. And it's a little bit easier if you're Putin because you don't particularly care about how many of your own citizens' lives are lost in this, or even how much of your own military materiel you're throwing at it, or how much of the rest of your economy you're sacrificing. Democracies operate differently, so, you know, there were constraints on us that there were not on him. But I still think that, you know, it is essential that the free nations support Ukraine's sovereignty, not just for Ukraine's reasons, but for the rules of the road that favor freedom on this planet. Otherwise, you know, what lessons are other autocrats going to take around the world? That they can just bite off a piece of a country or a whole country and keep it, right?
Right. So let's talk about Trump for a second. So we just experienced an historic election.
Did we?
Yeah, I think so. It was going to be historic either way. As you look at Trump and his team's approach to foreign policy, what do you posit will be the least obvious and biggest impact? And in the name of hope for the best, prepare for the worst, what do you think the best outcomes of his foreign policy could be, and what would be the worst?
That's a big question, and we're in an open forum here. So I would simply say two things. First of all, look, the American people have spoken. And as I said to my own students after the election up at Columbia, we set a democratic example. The people voted. It was peaceful. There will be a peaceful transfer of power. And the president has the right to try out, not only on the U.S. nation, but on world affairs, some of his ideas in the world of national security and foreign policy and global economics. He is not an adherent to the Bretton Woods system. He is an adherent to the old 1930s system of tariff and that kind of thing, and we'll see how that goes. The things that I worry about most, I think, is that it has been an enormous geostrategic, economic, values-based benefit to the United States to have democratic allies and partners. So one of the things that was painful to me in the first Trump administration was how rough he was on allies. Now, granted, yes, everybody and rich countries should pay their fair share, should pull their weight, all of those kinds of things. But just as one example, for all of President Trump's hectoring of allies in his first term about paying their fair share and 2% of GDP for NATO, only 9 countries made that level by the time he left office. We now have 23 countries, 24 countries, depending, who are at 2% of GDP. Now, you can thank Mr. Putin for that because they're scared, so they're putting more money into security. But you can also, I think, give some credit to the team approach that Biden went back to. So I hope that we are, given all the challenges that we have, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the general autocratic power grab, I hope that we are remembering who our friends are, remembering who our family is, strengthening that family, growing that family, because there are so many countries in the mid-level, in the hedging space, who would like to have a good relationship with the United States, but will choose other friends if we are not a welcoming partner. And I'm talking about countries from India to Brazil to Indonesia to the Gulf states, et cetera. So that's what I hope will be better this time around, but we'll see. And then the last piece here is just there is a core of American constitutionality, which was unique at its founding and is extremely precious still on this planet. So as a citizen, we will see the president has a mandate, the president-elect has a mandate, what he chooses to do in policy. But I think as citizens, what we must not allow is that the core of the structure of checks and balances, of separation of powers, of advice and consent of the Senate, budgeting power of the Congress, a free press, and an independent judiciary must not be touched. And if those things get touched, that have been the core of who we are since the founding, we as citizens need to stand up.
Thank you. Appreciate that so much. Could you share an example or two from when you felt conflicted with the decisions the administration and president for whom you were working asserted, but with which you disagreed, and how you coped with that, or what the tools were within government to allow you to dissent?
Many, many times throughout my career, whether it was that we weren't doing anything in the face of a very difficult and later genocidal situation on the ground in Bosnia and Srebrenica, if you all remember that, which ultimately spurred President Clinton to go in and support a resolution of that war. That was the first time that I saw real dissent in the department, and when I was personally uncomfortable with U.S. inaction, lack of U.S. leadership. We talked earlier about the fact that, I am one of those rare bureaucrats who worked happily for Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney all in one lifetime. When I was working for Vice President Cheney, technically speaking, the issue of how we would handle detainees and torture policy would have been under my writ. I, for a whole bunch of reasons, asked to be recused from that aspect of the national security portfolio I oversaw. He allowed that. I would say in the Bosnia context, let me go back a little bit. I was working for Strobe Talbot, who was deputy secretary then. We worked very hard internally to get a change of policy, and we eventually got there. But it was difficult, and there were a lot of younger diplomats in my cohort who chose to leave rather than to fight that way. In this case, with regard to detainee policy, I asked to be cut out of those things, and the vice president, to his credit, gave that part of the portfolio to somebody else. When President Trump was elected the first time, and I was assistant secretary for Europe, as you go up the ladder, your choices are different, right? Mm-hmm. And I talked about this in the career talk a little bit. I couldn't figure out, he came into office very antithetical to historic European allies like Germany and very sympathetic to Putin. And I couldn't figure out how I could be supportive of Germany on Thursday and skeptical of Russia, and supportive of Russia and skeptical of Germany on Friday. So I chose to step back and step down, which I did. So there are many, many ways to express yourself and fight in the system, work on something else, or ultimately sometimes, particularly at a high level, you have to make a change.
These are tough decisions. I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up. So you were working as Deputy Security Advisor to Dick Cheney in the wake of 9/11, when the U.S. was implementing its ultimately failed policy regarding Iraq. What did you learn, and how did you apply that learning in future situations? And similarly, are there other examples of learning from major policy challenges, for example, Libya?
Iraq to Libya.
I'm just keeping it light.
Yeah, exactly. In my course, I actually taught the two conflicts, or we discussed the two conflicts in the same week. So that was sort of in the context of choices to intervene militarily and not. Look, I think it is very easy to judge a decision about military intervention from backwards to forwards again. How did it turn out? What happened? There were many, many errors made. I would just say that at the time, and there are people in the room who were already grown-ups at the time, we had this incredibly awful experience of being hit on U.S. soil for the first time since Pearl Harbor. We had lost more than 2,000 citizens. We had completely missed the growing terror threat. And concurrently, you had this guy, Saddam Hussein, who had for 10 years defied UN demands that Russia and China also supported for full inspection of his weapons program, who had ROPA-doped inspectors, who had supported terrorist groups of one kind or another. And so there was an intense feeling on the part of the president, on part of the entire leadership team, that if U.S. intelligence is smoking, which it was on some of these things, we're not going to be fooled again. We can't afford to be hit again. And there was a demand on the part of the American people as well. If you remember, before he went into Iraq, Bush went to the Congress and asked for permission to intervene. And it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, including with some 23 Democratic votes. because of what the intelligence picture we were given looked like. I would say ultimately there was a failure of imagination, including human psychology, which is so, so important in diplomacy. So if you have an aspiration to be a diplomat for any country, do a little psychology coursing. Saddam, as it turned out, was afraid to admit to his own or to the international community what he didn't have, because of the vulnerabilities he would have had at home, his boasting, all of that kind of thing. And it never occurred to us that was, well, I wouldn't say it never occurred to us, but that was not a prevailing feeling. The prevailing feeling was fear, worry, vulnerability. Now, that's a different matter than how we chose to go into Iraq, how little preparation we did on the civilian side, how poor the military operation itself was, including civilian protection on the ground. So that's a whole nother lunch, which we can talk about in a different form. So I learned a lot about how to really interrogate intelligence, how to think about human motivation. I learned a lot about pre-planning before you move, particularly on the civilian political side, because, Colin Powell was not wrong when he said, you break it, you take it. And we had to then figure out how to get back to a legitimate Iraqi-led political entity in a country that had been suppressed by an autocrat forever. I would say those same lessons come into play again in Libya, where, as my friend Chris Stevens, who was killed in Benghazi, a dear friend of mine, said, Libya hadn't had any politics for 40 years. So when you get rid of Gaddafi, which, I believe it was the right thing for the U.S., supported by the Arab countries and supported by Europe, to go in and ensure that Gaddafi could not massacre a whole beautiful city of his own people. But I think we were not prepared for him for governance post-Gaddafi, and the Libyans weren't. And then the question became, they're still fighting over who they should be politically. Should we have, along with the support that we offered, been a little bit stronger with them in ensuring that new forms of terrorism didn't arise within Libya, that they didn't become a pawn of the great powers, that they came together to settle some of their differences. So, just that the fundamental lesson here is that the political tool and the military tool and the alliance tool have to come and work in tandem, and you have to really understand the humans and the culture that you are working with.
Thank you very much. Why don't we take some questions? I see one in the back. Yes? Wait 1 second. We're going to bring you a microphone.
Thanks. Thank you so much for coming. I just came from another class where we had a guest speaker who was a career soldier in the U.S. military, and he enlisted around the same time that you entered the Foreign Service. And he made it pretty clear that he believes that he has experienced the decline of U.S. hard power. And I was wondering if you've experienced, if you feel that you've experienced a similar thing from the diplomatic, more soft power perspective, or if you would disagree with that conclusion or perspective.
I guess I would ask, as compared to what and as compared to when, right? I still believe that, we're obviously still the greatest military on this planet. Do we always deploy properly? Do we always deploy effectively? Do we always integrate all the tools of power properly, as we just discussed? Not always. But I also think the days of the U.S. acting alone, if we ever really did, because I think if you go through modern history, we almost never act alone, are over and should be over. That whether you're talking about diplomatic power, political power, economic power, military power. We are better off when we take action together with allies, whether it is affirmative and attractive action, trying to create a larger community to deal with common problems with, like climate, like food insecurity, all those kinds of things, or whether it's when we are trying to stop genocide, stop bad actors, stop war. So I still think that we are the greatest conveners and we are the greatest assemblers of coalitions of common action. And if you think about what happens when we don't play, as my former boss, Secretary Blinken, used to say, either nobody leads and you end up with chaos in a vacuum, or folks you don't want to lead take it over and it's not in U.S. interest. So, I think that we need to look hard at military modernization of various kinds. I think we are going to need, no matter who was president, whether it was Harris or whether it was Trump, we need more investment in U.S. hard power. But I also think, as I said at the very, very beginning, that one of our greatest strengths is our ability to bring countries together, and particularly democratic countries together. And if we don't do that, it makes it harder for us, and we usually don't succeed. So I don't think we've lost our ability. It's just a question of whether we will lose our will, and I hope not.
So I did a bad job as moderator for that moment. And I forgot to ask you your name and what year you're in and what your concentration is, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. I'm Julia. I'm a sophomore. I'm a junior, and I'm studying political science. Sorry.
Thank you. And
You're a junior undergrad?
Yeah.
Great.
So as you ask your questions, please share your name, your year, your concentration, or if you're a community member, you do not need to share your year. But if you were to go back to university, what would you study? So that's the community member questions if they're asked. Yes, please. I see over in the right-hand side.
Thank you for being here. My name's Nash. I'm an undergrad sophomore. I study political science and philosophy. I've been seeing a lot about incoming members and like Republican leadership in Congress talking about sanctioning the ICC and generally taking hard stances against like international judicial bodies like that. I understand that international law is an incredibly difficult thing to enforce and find global consensus on. But how do you see the American role in like the enforcement and building and construction of international law being, especially going into this next administration? And like what implications do you think this administration will have for kind of international legal bodies?
I think it remains to be seen. As we saw last time, and as you see with all presidents, on the campaign trail, they say a lot. As they plan their transition, they say a lot. What they actually choose to prioritize and how effective they are at prioritizing is another thing. The U.S. is not a member of the ICC. We are a member of the ICJ, and we're not a member of the ICC because presidents of both parties, members of Congress of both parties, the American people have felt that the structure of it doesn't necessarily give the United States a fair shake. It demands leadership and then potentially penalizes us for it. So, but we are a member of the ICJ because we like the way that structure. We think it's fair. We have an American judge on the court. The way its jurisprudence is enacted, we think makes more sense, and that's been pretty bipartisan. When I think about the judicial instrument on this planet, I want to start with, is an independent judiciary going to be respected in the United States? Are we going to continue to set the gold standard for jurisprudence inside our own country? And, we've got a lot of democratic countries, including NATO countries, who have been backsliding or playing with backsliding. Poland's been sort of in and out, and they're coming back with judicial independence. It's an issue that even my Ukrainian friends have had difficulty with. You see what's happening in Hungary. So, let's start with whether, as sovereign democracies, we are protecting the independence of the courts. With regard to international law, when it works, it's spectacular, right? But also, it can't be set in stone. If you think about the founding of the United Nations, I just took my own students to the UN on Friday, and we heard from lots of different people. The UN needs reform, and the voting structure is such that everybody's checkmating that reform. And so the institution is becoming harder and harder to use as a tool of collective common good and action. But that's a different matter than whether the UN agencies are just as relevant as they ever were: UNICEF, UNDP, World Health Organization, all these kinds of things. So, President-elect Trump has made a lot of the same comments about the UN system, for example, that the fee structure isn't fair, that countries need to pay their own way, that it has been historically too anti-Israel, all of that kind of stuff. But I was also reminded when I was there on Friday by some folks at the UN mission that in his first term, he actually was heard to say, "Let's make the UN great again." So let's hope that we go in that direction, because it is stuck on many fronts.
Thank you so much, Nash. Let me go in the middle here, please. No, you. Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Yes, hi, I'm Lau Goldstein. I direct the China initiative here at Watson, and have a great interest in the former Soviet Union as well. I'm on my way to Kazakhstan and spent a lot of time in Moldova as well in the last few years. Let me ask you a few, these may be kind of tough questions, but one is, we're watching the situation in Ukraine. It's, I think, deteriorating very badly. How come there hasn't been any kind of direct contact between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov? I mean, for 2 years, I think they have hardly exchanged words, even though the front hasn't moved at all. You would think, to me, the minimal description of the chief diplomat is to, help bring this to an end. So that's one question. The other is, taking the former Soviet Union, looking at various cases here, like Moldova, for example, Georgia, there are frozen conflicts, right? Or, I said I'm headed to Kazakhstan. I'm headed to Kazakhstan in a month.
It's always great to go to Kazakhstan in the middle of the winter.
Yes, skiing, I think. But Tajikistan, Armenia, there's a variety of countries in the former Soviet Union that's still kind of under the yoke of Russian imperialism. Let's face it. But aren't these countries, ultimately still better off than Ukraine, which is destroyed?
Let me start with the first question. And, again, we're in an open forum, so I'm happy to have a sidebar conversation with you a little bit afterwards. I would argue that both President Biden and Secretary Blinken tried pretty damn hard with both Putin and Lavrov early in this thing, and particularly in that period when we found the intelligence indicating that the Russians intended to do this, which was in late October of 21. Through the beginning parts of the invasion, we offered, as you remember, bilateral talks on strategic stability to try to better understand what might deter or have Putin change his mind. Wendy Sherman, our colleague, ran those. The Russians came to one round, had no leash from Putin to really engage at all, and declined our offer to have a second round. The president talked to Putin a couple of times and just got basically a blast about how Ukraine was theirs and we should get out of the way and that we were a threat to Russia, all of us. Secretary tried a number of times with Lavrov, including as recently as, I want to say, a year ago on the margins of one of these conferences. And, it's hard to know foreign ministers work and secretaries of state work for their presidents. They can only negotiate to the extent that they have any room from their head of state. But suffice to say, in this open format, there was no indication on Lavrov's side that he had any room to negotiate or anything to say that could actually de-escalate the conflict. And I think that continues. Look, are these countries that are not in the middle of a massive Russian war better off? Absolutely. And you could argue that thanks to what the U.S. and our allies have done to shore up democratic choice in Georgia until recently, over 30 years, in Moldova certainly, and continuingly, even in places like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, they might look much more Soviet, much more Russian-yoked than they do now. I think there's also a question of, how many of these things one can intervene in at the same time. You're a scholar of China. You know that we have stability obligations in the Indo-Pacific too, in the Middle East. So there's a lot going on this planet. But the fact that despite his best efforts, Putin couldn't roll back government in Moldova. Sandu won, I think, is a tribute to her, is a tribute to Moldovans. It's a tribute to all the support that they've had all of these years. In Georgia, it's a really difficult story, but I think there the corrupting influence has been overpowering, unfortunately.
Thank you, Professor Goldstein. Please, Julian. Wait. We're going to get you a microphone.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. My name is Julian. I'm a senior studying international affairs with a particular focus on East Asia.
And you're going to take the Foreign Service exam, right? You're going to sign up in January, and you're going to take the exam in February, even if you don't want to come into the Foreign Service, to see what happens.
All right. I just wanted to ask, it seems as if Europe has had a very privileged place in American foreign policy, and that American leaders consider European countries like France and Britain and Germany as kind of not only allies, but cultural peers and civilizational peers to the United States. And it seems now as if Europe is relatively stagnant, if not in relative decline, in terms of economically, demographically, and in other ways. And so as someone who's dedicated much of her career to ties between America and Europe, do you think Europe should continue being like a primary or central region for American foreign policy? Or is it time for America to maybe recenter on our own region or to other regions?
Are you a pivoter?
Yeah.
I hate that term because it implies that you stop doing one thing and do another thing. And frankly, the United States has global interests. We have global trade. We have a global community. We have global partners when we engage. So unfortunately, I am not in the school that believes you can stop doing this and do that. I think we've got to be involved and engaged and listening and working together everywhere. Look, I do think that we have, you're a student of history, right? How did we get into this deep, deep relationship with Europe? We went to war twice in the 20th century because Europe was ripping itself apart, and they were our main trade market then, and they were there was a risk that all of that was coming to us. That's also how we become involved more deeply with China and with Japan. There are places where we have long histories of either intervening to stop conflict or working together in other parts of the world. I think you can deepen and broaden in places where our relationships are less mature or less deep or newer at the same time that you are strengthening those relationships. I do worry right now that as the U.S. economy recovers, we also need the European economy to recover. We need the Japanese and South Korean economies to recover if we're going to work together. But we also need, as a community of mature democracies, the G7 and the mature democracies within the G20, to be lifting up other countries that have potential that they haven't been able to realize. And as Tony Blinken likes to say again, make them the better offer than the autocrats are offering. So that takes you to the Brazils and the Central Americans and the South Africas and Nigerias of this world. So we need to do more in more places, unfortunately, and I hope that we will. But again, we're only going to have the capacity to do that if we do it in a burden sharing way with other democracies who also have those interests. So I'm not an either or girl. I'm a all of the above girl.
Thank you.
I'm going to take just moderator prerogative for 1 second to do one more question that I think fits in here, and then I'll come back and keep the microphone over in that corner. I see you. I want to talk about mis and disinformation for a moment. Unbeknownst to many, when I started out in the State Department in 2014, Ambassador Nuland and Rick Stengel, who was our Undersecretary for Public Affairs, and a number of others, set up a very innovative information hub in Belgium to counter the mis and disinformation that was happening from the Russians into Europe. How did we not detect the attack on our own country in 2016? And you served as spokesperson and are a media expert. What nations are doing the best at combating this scourge right now? And what can and should the students be studying to be a part of the solution?
Just a small bunch of questions. I think in 2016, our understanding of how state sponsors of disinformation could use bots and other relatively new technologies to accelerate the propagation of disinformation was less well understood. I think that, it's because it's a relatively diffuse weapon when it is used. You have to not only figure it out, but you also have to be able to attribute. We were very slow at attribution. If you remember, I think it was late 15, early 16 when Macron ran the first time, and the Russians were pulling a similar stunt on him. The French were much quicker, even in the campaign cycle, to attribute some of this nasty stuff to outside forces. We've gotten better at that. I do think, as we talked about a little bit, there's a question of responsibility of social media companies too, and there's the long debate. Any of you studying this know this. Is a social media company a pipe where stuff passes through and it's not their responsibility to know what's in the pipe, just to provide the pipe? Or are they a publisher, essentially, that they are the hosting platform and therefore have responsibility? And that is an undecided question, both in the U.S. approach to this, but in the democratic approach. So, I frankly think that in the same way that we don't allow entities to promote violence or child porn or any of these things, I think folks who are in the business of transmitting have to bear some responsibility, and I think we need some global norms around that. And we actually saw, U.S. social media companies playing into it and revving into it. But at a minimum, we need much more citizen awareness of what's happening here. So I think that's getting better. I think your generation probably is more skeptical of what you see online. And I hope that students of all of this stuff you read broadly across the ideological spectrum and deeply in different kinds of media. But we've got to continue to educate Americans and the world.
Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you. First of all, such a fantastic discussion. My name is Michael Kennedy. I'm on the sociology and Watson faculty here. And the original introduction to Ambassador Nuland prompts this question. Generally, what social movements in your experience or in your study have enhanced the range of American diplomacy most? And I'm going to say this because one could argue, being also a student of the Polish Solidarity movement, that the Solidarity movement transformed the world in a way that enhanced American diplomacy's capacity to reconstruct the world of democracies and alliance. So that's an easy one. What other social movements might you point to, either that enhanced American diplomacy's intentions or directions, or transform the landscape sufficiently that it would improve American diplomacy's better angels?
Well, first of all, I love that there are senior sociologists at Watson, because as I said, psychology, sociology, as useful and interesting and important tools of the diplomatic craft as any of the rest of it, because fundamentally, if robots ran the world, it wouldn't be any fun and there wouldn't be diplomats. It's about human beings, and it's about hearing and touching and smelling. And obviously the anti-apartheid movement, I think, is right up there. Whether that enhances U.S. diplomacy or not, I don't know, but it certainly enhanced the human condition, and it showed, as a founding liberation movement, showed people who were poorly governed that if they unify and stand up and get international support, they can make change. And you see that replicated around the world. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You know, we all had great hope for the Arab Spring and it didn't turn out the way we expected. But nonetheless, the fact that humans took agency over their own lives and futures and demanded better of their government and got international support for it gives people hope that they can change their circumstance. So that's certainly one thing. Look, I think in a weird and awful way, the COVID pandemic changed the conversation because as large democratic countries in the UN agencies as well, we saw a different kind of inequity on this planet than we had understood before. In this case, the fact that only 3 or 4 major countries made vaccine and had the patents and had the distribution network. And that's not good because we can never produce enough, and because different regions of the planet need to take agency in protecting their citizens. So you saw the African Union, which had never really had global health as a common goal, they had supported nationally, begin to think about, we need to manufacture, we need to support distribution systems that are better distributed. You see the same in Latin America. You see it with, developments in Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, to take agency. So I think that was a bizarre, perverse example. I'm sure there are many more. I'm going to think about your question on the train to New York tonight.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much for calling me over to Sam. That was so nice of you, Michelle. Nicely done.
That was so nice, Michelle, for you to bring in Sam. Thank you. I know, right? Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you both for being here. Thank you for making the trip. So you've spoken a little bit about...
Wait, Sam, who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm Sam. I'm a senior studying politics, philosophy, and economics.
And you're also taking the Foreign Service exam, right?
I'll take the Foreign Service exam. Yeah. So you've spoken a bit about your work promoting democracy abroad.
Supporting democracy. We don't promote. The people on the ground have to promote. We support.
Supporting democracy abroad. And I think that's great work. And also, we've seen this movement domestically, certainly within my lifetime, right? Pretty unambiguously away from democracy and away from democratic norms, and believing that democracy is even the best system in the United States. And I agree with you that we have set a good example with the peaceful transfer of power, but we've transferred power to a man who has shown great flippancy towards democracy. So I'm wondering, what lessons have you learned abroad that we can apply here to try to remind people that democracy is a good system? And I think kind of moving beyond even just saying, promote checks and balances, because if people don't believe in those checks and balances, they'll disappear, right? And then second, and maybe more provocatively, what would you say to the people, probably not in this room, but maybe outside of this room, who would say, no, I don't believe in democracy. I don't think it's the best system in America, and I don't think we should support it abroad.
Just a small question.
Yeah. Sam, that was a super slacker of a question. I'm kidding you. I'm totally kidding you. That was a great question.
Look, I will go back to what I said at the beginning. Our founding was unique. We're not a blood and soil country. We are a country founded around the creed of individual human rights. We did not at our founding live up to that. We have never perfected it. But we've been on the search for that all the way through our history, including at times when there was mass opposition, like around the Civil War, where the South had a very different conception of how the country should be governed. We fought a war over it. I hope we're not going to go in that direction. I don't think we will. But what I would say is the system is extremely precious and unique. Countries around the world, people around the world have sought to emulate it and have succeeded or failed at various levels. But it's up to you and every single one of us to continue to fight for it. And folks who don't appreciate what it means to go before a court and to know that those people are going to judge you based on the evidence, not on what the people who appointed them want to have happen, have never had that experience. People who would support a controlled press have never lived in a country where you go to jail if you hold up a sign that says "Free Ukraine" for 5 years, like Russia. So, for those of us who understand it and believe in it, we have to fight for it with everything that we've got, even as we understand, as I said at the beginning, that a newly elected president can experiment with any domestic or foreign policies, but he can't touch the hardcore of that. But your generation's going to have to fight for it. We're all going to have to fight for it. And for anybody who doesn't appreciate those basic rights and the individual rights, I would ask them, do you have anybody in your family who might be subject to arbitrary deportation without fair legal recourse? Do you have anybody in your family who's got a big fat mouth like I do or my husband does, who could go to jail for that? Do you have anybody in your family who loves differently or worships differently, who could be imprisoned for that? Think about it extremely personally. But I get the feeling folks in this room will fight to preserve those things, because I've lived in countries where that stuff is not a given and it's not fun, and I wouldn't want it for my kids, and I don't want it here.
Thank you so, so much. I see a question in the back, and then we'll come back over here. Please.
Can I just redact your...
We want the mic because we're recording it as well. We're live streaming it. So
to that point, if you are to that point, we welcome your identity and major. But if you're not comfortable saying who you are because we're recording, please feel free to just raise your hand and ask a question. It's not a problem.
First off, hi. Thank you both for taking the time today to speak with us. My name is Nick. I'm a sophomore studying international affairs and computer science here. And my question is, you touched briefly on other autocrats around the world watching, Ukraine and the reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. And I'm curious about a more concrete example that comes to mind for me of Taiwan, and maybe how the calculus changes for the Chinese government based on the US's action or inaction going forward, and maybe how you've seen that change from 2019 to now, post Ukraine, and with the incoming new Trump administration.
Well, that's the first example everybody always cites, that if Putin can get away with seizing control, whether it's physically, politically, economically, of a sovereign Ukraine, what lesson will Xi Jinping take about whether the world will stand up for Taiwan's right to choose, not just the United States, but to choose its own form of government? Now, that's a different matter than where Xi Jinping chooses to go or when he chooses to go there. But I think he is certainly going to school on the global reaction, and, including we talk about de-risking our economy from China versus decoupling, but, does he want to actually do more decoupling so he's got freedom of action and is protected from sanctions? What does it mean about his own military preparedness and our military preparedness? What does it mean about alliance? So the Chinese spend a lot of time in the UN saying that they are the more benign power, right? And how many others are they convincing? So if they actually chose to move, would they face global opprobrium or wouldn't they? And again, how successful is the free world at standing up for international law? Remember that the founding principle in the UN Charter, go back and read it, students of international politics, if you haven't read it recently, is sovereignty of states. Now, the Taiwan example, we agree to disagree exactly what it is, or we believe in one China, but we also believe in the sovereign right of the Taiwanese to self-govern. But in the Ukraine case, it is completely unambiguous, right? So if the world doesn't stand up for the principles of the Charter, then you've got a free-for-all. And we remember what a free-for-all looked like, right? We went through 2 world wars that way, so we don't want to be back there.
Okay. Thank you so much. Please.
Over to the left.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm getting you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is David Dean. I'm a professor in the medical school. When I was an undergrad, I thought I'd be a diplomat, but I got an A in biology, so here I am. Anyway, sorry. I just have a more poignant question. Then Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, in 2008 wrote a famous memorandum. It's called "Niet means Niet," and basically saying that expansion of NATO towards Ukraine or into Ukraine would be the reddest of red lines for the Russian leadership of all groups, including Navalny. So in light of that, many serious students of international affairs say that U.S. policy since 2008 seemed designed to provoke Russian military intervention, and that perhaps the U.S. saw an opportunity for a strategic defeat on Russia with what we now see are tragic consequences. So how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, Bill Burns is a dear friend of mine. We've, come up together in the service. When he was in Moscow, and sometimes where you sit is what you're sending, I was at NATO. So we actually wrote competing memos at that time. Just to remind that NATO expansion does not begin in 2008, and it doesn't even begin in 1997. It begins when Germany gets added, when Turkey and Greece get added, when Spain gets added. And what is NATO? It is a defensive alliance. NATO does not go to war unless it is attacked. And it is an open opportunity for countries who want to defend their security together. I remember when the Soviet Union fell and we were having conversations with Yeltsin, and I was in many of those because I was a young diplomat working for the great Strobe Talbot. And there was a question in Russian minds whether they might eventually want to join NATO. It would have been a very different Russia, obviously. Democrat would have had to have met all the democratic standards. And Putin himself maybe toyed with it a little bit. But for us to say to other countries, including all of these nations who had been captured by the Kremlin for so many decades or centuries, depending upon how you look at it, that they don't have a right to associate in their own defense with others, would have been to give a veto over their future back to the Kremlin. And I don't think anybody was prepared to do that, nor do I think that there's anything that NATO has ever done that has concretely threatened Russia, despite this amazing narrative of grievance that Putin has spun. Even if you had a Ukraine within NATO, there is the notion that Ukraine was going to attack Russia is pure Putin fantasy designed to justify his own imperial ambition to have a sphere of influence over others. We went through that in the 19th century. It didn't work out so well. We tried it in the 20th century. It didn't work out so well. So I'm a sovereigntist.
Please.
Hi, I'm Bianca. I'm a senior majoring in Middle East Studies and International and Public Affairs, and thank you both so much for being here today. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the decisions and policies and factors that drive U.S. military interventions abroad. You spoke a little bit about Iraq and Libya. And obviously, in Libya, the decision was to invoke R2P in order to oust Gaddafi, yet within a couple of months, obviously, conflict was erupting in Syria, and that same principle was not invoked. So what are the sort of policies that are guiding U.S. decisions to intervene militarily or not? And within your career, have you witnessed changes in attitudes towards military intervention as you look at conflicts today in Ukraine and also in Gaza?
There are many pieces of that elephant that you just spun. I would just say in my experience, every one of these decision sets is unique. I would say that at the current moment, the sort of high water mark for R2P comes after we fail to act in Rwanda and see such a massive, massive genocide. And Rwanda occurs at a time when we are thinking that we're having convergence among the great powers, and we are trying to open the global system and the global institutions for participation by Russia and China, and that we'll all be one big family trying to solve global problems together. Libya and Bosnia, relatively successful, although you create a state that's not really a state. Kosovo, a little bit more complicated for all the reasons. I think Libya was a turning point because we had convergence with Russia and China that the international community, in part because the Arab world was, the regional powers were very insistent that the international community should not let genocide happen inside Libya. But then when Gaddafi meets his untimely end, they all decide that wasn't what we were voting for. We were just voting to stop him, not to overthrow him, which, a little bit complicated. So I think that's the beginning of the questioning of whether international humanitarian intervention can gain at least Security Council support. And you see the debate now about Haiti, even though the vast majority of Haitians want more international support, and the Chinese are not down with it, and the Russians are not down with it. But now, as compared to where we were then, where you had sparks of national stuff within nations, and it was a question of whether countries, big powers, were going to intervene within sovereign states, either at invitation or to stop a genocide. Now you've actually got cross-border stuff like Russia into Ukraine, Hamas's attack on Israel. So it changes how you look at these things, and it changes how you evaluate what the role of outside powers could and should be. In the Ukraine case, as we've discussed here, are you supporting the sovereign right of a country to determine its own future and not be eaten by somebody else? In the case of Israel's response to Gaza, they were attacked. They were not, they were largely minding their own business. How they propagate that response is a different matter. But certainly they were going to respond, and international law would generally allow response. The problem is, how it's conducted, obviously. So many, many factors, different circumstances.
Thanks, Andy. Please, over in the right. Thank you so much for that question, Bianca.
I'm Zach. I'm a freshman studying international relations, and I got a bit of a tough question here. You hinted that American support for Ukraine is important to set an example that autocrats can't just invade other countries, and I agree with that. But as the death toll continues to rise in Ukraine with no end in sight, where do you draw the line? Do you think it would be worth it to keep funding the Ukrainian military if the war went on for another 10 years and killed another 1 million people, instead of making a peace deal now, even if that peace deal favored Russia?
Look, we are supporting Ukraine's sovereign decision to defend itself, right? If Ukraine chose to make a peace, even an unjust peace with Russia, we would support that as well. I think the concern, not to speak for Ukrainians, but the concern that they have is that there isn't a just peace to be had right now that doesn't result in a reigniting of this conflict. And then once Putin has Ukraine, might he continue, including towards us. So look, I think that President Trump will try a different cocktail in this conflict, but U.S. involvement is still being asked for by a Ukraine that is fighting for its sovereign life. So it would be a big decision for us to deny Ukraine that support in the face of this level of aggression and horror from its neighbor. It would be a big decision in terms of abandoning Ukraine, but as we've talked about, it would be a big decision in terms of international precedent. I would remind also that Putin is presiding over the annihilation of his own population through this thing. There have been days, month on month, where 1,000 Russians have lost their lives on the front line every single day, and he's allowing that to happen. So I would first ask the question of Putin. He could stop any day, and he should.
I'm going to just do one more prerogative, and then I'll roll it back to you all. And this, so you as Assistant Secretary were based in D.C. but traveled a lot. As ambassador, you lived abroad. And as undersecretary, you have been traveling all over the globe all the time. You've raised a beautiful family. And how have you done that? How have you, I personally don't believe there's work-life balance as much as there's work-life continuum, but how have you navigated being this globetrotter and living abroad and raising a family and being healthy and being so grounded? How have you done that?
Well, you were very kind, and you have 2 amazing brownies of your own, my friend. Look, I am a very lucky human. I'm just a very lucky human. I got married very young to an amazing person, and we have worked really hard to talk to each other and make all our decisions together, including when to be overseas and when not to be overseas. I early in my career, I'll tell a funny story here in a moment, but I turned down assignments that were not good for him. He turned down opportunities that were not good for me. When the kids were old enough to, as my daughter used to say, be done being the bit player in the movie of your life, Mom. They made some decisions, and we stayed home after they got into junior high and high school because that was better for them and allowed them to have more agency over their own lives. But mostly, I think what I usually say to younger professionals, no matter what career you're in, remember Freud's great dictum that you need 2 things for a happy life. You need good love and you need good work. And you have to work hard at both of them. And you have to know if they come in conflict with each other, which one's going to take priority for you. For me, that's always been easy. But I also am very, very lucky. So the funny story is, when the Soviet Union broke up, there weren't too many of us who had good Russian, and I had been in the service about 15 years. I hadn't even done my deputy ambassador tour. I got offered a chance to be ambassador after about 15 years in. And all of my mentors said, when they offer you an ambassadorship, you got to take it. And I went home and I said to my husband, because if you don't take it, you're never going to get offered again. I went home and I said to my husband, hey, babe, how do you feel about Existan? I'm not going to name which country it was. And he said, "How do you feel about divorce?" And I didn't take the job. And 5 years later, I was ambassador to NATO. So, I just think you have to make your priorities clear. For me, they've always been in my kitchen first. And I'm very lucky to have had an amazing husband and partner who supported that, and kids who've been pretty clear about what they needed to. So I know you have too.
I certainly have. As ambassador, we pivoted from me to we very deliberately. So
we're gonna unfortunately we have to stop the open Q&A and thank Ambassador Levine and Ambassador Nuland for such a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate it, because Ambassador Nuland has to catch a train. But we do have a little bit of time as we break up this evening if people want to come up and say hello and chat and ask a few more questions privately. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Susie.